to start out with an oil change. I ran the motor for a little while to get it warmed up. Got all the oil flowing in there, and if there's any impurities in there, it kicked it up and hopefully got caught by the oil filter. Here we have the oil filter cap. So underneath here is your oil filter that goes into the crankcase. Right here you've got your oil pump assembly, and right here you've got your drain plug for the crankcase. So we're going to start out by dropping the oil, and this is a 1 1/4 inch crankcase plug. So then we're going to move on to change the oil filter. Make sure you change that every time you do the oil. So this is your oil filter cap. And it's got a 1 1/4 inch nut on there as well. And once the oil stops draining out of the oil filter, you can go through and loosen this up. Just be careful and be ready to catch it, because if you're not paying attention, it'll all come out at once and then you got a mess on your hands. If that oil filter cap is stuck on there, you can tap on it with a rubber mallet or use a screwdriver to lightly pry on it. Sometimes they get caught on there. I've got the assembly out, and there's our old oil filter. And then underneath the oil filter cap, there's a rubber gasket that goes around this entire thing here. You want to make sure that you check that to see if it's damaged in any way. And if so, or if you're having leaks, you'll need to replace it. This one's been in there for at least 2 or 3 years. So we're going to get that one replaced. So to replace that O-ring in here, the gasket, you want to just dig in there with a screwdriver and pry it out. Sometimes they're caught in there fairly well, so it might take you a little. Once you get one of the edges out, then you can start to peel it. And it'll pop right out. Then we're going to replace it with a new one. It's John Deere part number A519R. And you'll specifically have to ask for these at the dealership, because they typically don't give them to you with the oil filters. So what I like to do is I like to put just a slight coating oil on it. That kind of helps it not get stuck in there. And once you've done that, just work it, the new one back in. And just a word of caution, when you pull these out of there, if they do tear, make sure that you look to make sure you got the entire gasket out before you put a new one in. Otherwise you're going to have problems and it's going to leak on you. So there's the install of our new rubber gasket. And now we'll install our new John Deere oil filter. The part number on this one is going to be AR26350, and this filter is pretty much used in all of the 2 cylinders. So what I like to do is on the top and bottom, you've got these gaskets right here. I like to put a little oil on those so they don't get stuck in there. We'll do it to the bottom as well. And then what you're going to want to do is put the oil filter into your cap assembly and Stick it back up in the compartment. And you want to be careful with the assembly here, because if you over tighten it or you bend the shaft going up into the crankcase, that's going to cause you some major issues. So when you put this in, make sure it's seated properly, and then do not over tighten it, because if you over tighten it, you're going to bend that bolt in there, and if it snaps off, you're going to have to disassemble the entire oil pump assembly, and that's going to be a big issue. So you don't want to over tighten these, so just snug. Make sure that's snug. Seal up against the gasket. And that should suffice. Next, you're going to want to stick your drain plug back in the crankcase. And before I go there, so there is a washer right here. You can get those cheap at John Deere if you do have some leaks. It's basically an aluminum or a metal washer. I just replaced this one last year because it was leaking. And we'll tighten this up. And there we go. So our next step is we're going to put oil into the crankcase. So on the pulley side, this is going to be your oil fill area. Pop that cover off. And according to our manual, the capacity of the crankcase, including the oil filter compartment, is going to be 7 quarts. So we're going to put 7 quarts in to start off with. And I typically use 10W30 in all of my 2 cylinders. Just finished up putting the 7th quart in, so we're going to put the cap back on. Then what we need to do is we need to start the engine for just a few seconds so the oil can get into the oil filter compartment. Then we're going to check the oil level to make sure that we're where we need to be. So after you're in the engine for a few seconds, you're going to want to go underneath the tractor, check the drain plug and the oil filter cap to make sure you don't have any leaks. If you do have some leaks, you need to tighten those bolts up, or you've got another problem. Next thing, we want to make sure that we have enough oil in the crankcase. So on these first numbered series tractors, they didn't have a dipstick. This is your oil level test cock. So what you want to do is you want to loosen this nut here. And then there's a hole on the bottom here. If you've got enough oil in the tractor, when you loosen this, it'll start to drip out. So we're going to loosen that up. Sometimes it takes a second. See how it's dripping out of there? That means we got enough oil. Then tighten that back up. And this just has to be snug. You don't have to over tighten that. If you were to open that and let it sit for a few seconds and you didn't have any oil coming out, that means you're low. So then keep it open, pour more oil in until it starts to drip out, and then you're good to go. Once you flush the crankcase, then you're going to want to go through and clean out your air filter, which is an oil bath. So after I drain the oil out, you can see that there's some grime in there, some seeds. We use this tractor to cut hay, so those are some grass seeds that got caught in there. So we're going to clean that up, and then we're going to put fresh oil in. So I got it cleaned out, filled it up with the same oil that I put in the crankcase, and then we'll reinstall it. Next, we're going to tackle the cooling system. Since we had the tractor engine running earlier to get the oil warmed up, the coolant was circulating and any impurities in the cooling system would have been suspended by the water pump. So we might as well get that drained out. Now I've got a block heater on here, so I'm going to remove that assembly. And the capacity is 4.5 gallons, so make sure you've got at least a 5-gallon pail ready to collect. Now that the coolant's all drained out, put the drain plug back in, and then we're going to add more coolant back to the cooling system. So what I like to do is I use distilled water. Reason being is your typical water from home, especially in wells, is going to have lime in it. It's going to have rust in it, other minerals that you don't necessarily want sitting in your radiator for quite some time. So I use distilled water to keep those impurities out of there. Here's a gallon of concentrate. This is not pre-diluted. This is concentrate because I'm adding my own water, so I will create the 50-50 mixture. Once you've got 4.5 gallons in there, go ahead and replace your radiator cap. And if you do overfill it, it's not a huge deal, because right at the top here, there's an overflow. And what that does is as the engine runs and it gets heated up, it's gonna run out, and it's gonna run out right here. So it's gonna look like it's dripping out the bottom of your tractor. Had that happen to me last time I changed it, just let it drip for a little while, and didn't have any issues after that. Next, we're going to drain the PTO clutch housing. So underneath the tractor, right here is going to be your drain plug for your PTO, and that's going to be a 7/8 inch plug on there. And I removed the drawbar just to make it easier to get to. Once the PTO clutch housing is drained out, you'll want to put the drain plug back in, and then the fill plug is going to be right here. You want to pop that open. And I flush this every spring, since we run the PTO on haybine with this tractor. So pop that off, and the capacity of this housing is going to be around 2¼ quarts. And the manual calls for 10 weight, so I just use 10W30, which is the same I use in the crankcase and the air cleaner. What you want to do is you just want to fill it up to the bottom of the threads on the filler plug until the oil is about ready to run out, and then you're right where you need to be. So I put in a little over 2 quarts, and the oil level's right to the bottom of the filler plug threads. So that's all we need to do. Put the filler plug back in. And that's it for the PTO. Now we're going to tackle the transmission. And the capacity is roughly 4 gallons, so make sure that you've got a container big enough to house that. There's going to be 2 different plugs for this. You've got the rear axle housing plug there, and then you've got one right behind the crankcase here. So I like to do one at a time. We'll do the rear axle housing first. And I like to flush the transmission every year. Got the rear side mostly drained out, so now we'll do the front side. While the transmission's draining, we're going to drain the first reduction gear, since that shares the same weight fluid as the transmission, so that'll be 80/90. This is the plug right here. This is a belt pulley, and here's the plug for that. The first reduction gear housing only holds about a quart. And it's 9/16 inch bolt. And since it only holds a quart, I'm just going to use a little coffee can to collect that. Now that everything's drained out from the first reduction gear and the transmission, we can replace all the drain plugs. Now for the transmission, since it's approximately 4 gallons, what I did is I went and bought a pump that you simply just put into the 5-gallon bucket of fluid and pump it in that way. Since the transmission fill plug is right there and it's not easy to get to. It takes a little while, but it's a lot easier than trying to get it in with quarts. And the nice thing is about the transmission is you don't have to measure out your 4 gallons as you just fill it to the threads on the filler plug. So again, this is going to be your transmission fill plug here. Pop that out. And this is almost impossible to get to if you have a 3-point on, so I took mine off for this. Once you get that, if you buy a hand pump like I have, it's great. You just hang it in there. Start pumping until it's all the way up to the threads on the filler plug, so you don't have to measure out the 4 gallons. You just keep pumping until it runs out. So I added about 4 gallons of 80/90 weight to the transmission, and when I say fill it to the threads, you can see that the oil is right up to the threads on the filler plug. And that's how, during your farming season, that's how you check the oil level in the transmission if you have leaks. You pop the filler cap off, and if it's not up to the threads, fill it up. So reinstall the filler plug, and then we'll top off the first reduction gear. Once you've got the transmission filled up with 80/90, you're going to want to put another quart of 80/90 into the first reduction gear. So this is your crankcase oil fill, and this is going to be your fill for the first reduction gear. So you want to pop that off. And then go and add a quart of 80/90. And last, we're gonna tackle the power troll. So the drain plug for the power troll is gonna be right here. It's between the PTO drain and the rear axle housing for the transmission, so right here. And this one can kind of be a bugger to get to. So that's why I pulled the drawbar out. And this is gonna hold about 6 quarts. And I change this once a year. Once you've got the power troll drained out, put the drain plug back in. Now we're gonna fill it. So here on the back of the power troll is gonna be your filler plug. So we'll go ahead and pop that off. And again, it's approximately 6 quarts. So go ahead and start adding your hydraulic fluid. The manual calls for regular crankcase oil, but nowadays oil has detergent in it, and you put detergent oil in your power troll, it's going to foam up and you're probably going to have a hydraulic failure. So I use universal John Deere hydraulic fluid, and that way when I'm using it with different implements, it's the same oil going in and out with each implement in each tractor. And once you get close to putting 6 quarts in, you're going to want to open up the fluid test cock on the side, which I'll show you in a second. So on the belt pulley side of the power troll, you're going to see this oil level test cock right here. And that's the same as the crankcase. So we're going to loosen that, and it's opposite, so when you loosen it, it actually goes in. And you can see that it's running out already. And that means we're good. If it didn't run out, make sure you add more until it does run out.